Open the folder, Mr. Brooks, or admit you came here unprepared. The words landed with the confidence of a verdict long before any vote had been cast. Every eye inside the 22nd floor boardroom turned toward the black leather folder resting quietly in front of Malcolm Brooks, the only black CEO in the history of Ashcroft Capital. It sat perfectly aligned with the polished walnut table, untouched, unopened, almost forgotten by the one man everyone expected to reach for it. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a clear spring morning, but inside the room the air felt heavy enough to stop time. 12 board members occupied their seats. 11 of them had already exchanged subtle glances that suggested today's outcome had been decided before Malcolm ever walked through the door. Richard Halston, the oldest director on the board, leaned back in his chair with a smile that never reached his eyes. "We've all reviewed the numbers," he said, tapping the thick report in front of him. "If our CEO has anything meaningful to contribute, now would be the appropriate time." A few restrained chuckles drifted across the table. Malcolm heard every one of them. He simply folded his hands and looked calmly toward the large screen displaying the meeting agenda. He did not reach for the folder. He did not defend himself. He did not interrupt. That silence seemed to irritate them more than any argument could have. Patricia Wells, another director, adjusted her glasses and spoke with polished professionalism that barely concealed her contempt. "Investors expect leadership, Malcolm. Silence isn't a strategy." Someone near the end of the table quietly muttered, "Neither is pretending." The comment drew another wave of restrained laughter. Emily Carter, the youngest corporate secretary in the company's history, sat near the projector taking notes with practiced precision. She glanced toward Malcolm for only a second before lowering her eyes again. She had prepared the meeting materials herself late the previous evening. She knew exactly which documents had been distributed and exactly which ones had not. Still, she remained silent. Malcolm rested one hand lightly on top of the closed folder. His fingertips never slipped beneath the cover. Across the table, Richard noticed the gesture and smiled wider. "Interesting," he said. "You've been carrying that folder into every executive meeting this week, yet somehow you've never opened it." The room became still. Every director waited, expecting Malcolm to finally reveal whatever secret they imagined was hidden inside. Instead, he slowly removed his hand and placed it back on the table. "Not yet," he answered in an even voice. The reply confused more than it satisfied. Richard laughed openly this time. "Not yet? There won't be a later if this board loses confidence in you today." Malcolm met his eyes without raising his voice. "Then let's continue." His composure unsettled the room. Men and women who had entered expecting a desperate defense instead found themselves facing someone who seemed entirely comfortable allowing the meeting to unfold exactly as planned. That confidence made no sense to them. As the agenda moved toward financial performance, acquisition reviews, and governance concerns, every criticism seemed carefully rehearsed. Every question landed with suspicious precision. Every pause invited Malcolm to open the folder that remained perfectly closed before him. Yet he never touched it again. He simply listened while the accusations gathered like storm clouds over the polished table, as though he already knew something no one else in the room had discovered. The digital clock on the wall advanced by another minute, yet the atmosphere inside the boardroom only grew heavier. Malcolm Brooks remained exactly where he had been since the meeting began, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, his black leather folder still resting untouched before him. To everyone else in the room, that silence looked like uncertainty. To Malcolm, it was patience. Richard Halston cleared his throat before pressing a button on the conference remote. A series of financial charts appeared across the massive screen. Bright green projections from previous quarters had been replaced with carefully selected red arrows pointing downward. "These are the numbers our shareholders will remember," Richard announced confidently. "Leadership is measured by results, not promises." Several directors nodded almost immediately. Patricia Wells folded her hands together and added, "We cannot continue pretending the market has confidence simply because we want it to. Investors deserve stability." Malcolm studied the presentation without interrupting. He noticed every missing page, every shortened timeline, every conveniently omitted acquisition that had delivered record profits only months earlier. Still, he said nothing. Across the table, another director leaned toward Richard and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "He is either completely lost or completely finished." Quiet laughter circled the room once again. Emily Carter continued typing meeting notes, but something felt wrong. She had assembled the executive briefing package herself. The presentation on the screen was not the same version she remembered reviewing the previous evening. One entire section discussing long-term revenue growth had disappeared. Another slide now displayed percentages that seemed unfamiliar. She looked down at her laptop, opened the archived file, and compared it with the version being projected. Her heartbeat quickened. They were different. She looked toward Malcolm, wondering if he had noticed. He had. His eyes never left the screen, yet there was no surprise in them. It was almost as though he had expected every change before entering the room. Richard noticed Emily studying her computer. "Everything accurate, Ms. Carter?" he asked with a pleasant smile that carried more warning than kindness. Emily hesitated only briefly before answering, "Yes, sir. I am reviewing the records." Richard nodded, satisfied enough to move on. "Excellent. Then let us proceed." Malcolm slowly reached for his glass of water instead of the folder. The small movement frustrated several directors who had been waiting for him to defend himself. Patricia finally leaned forward. "You have every opportunity to explain your position, Malcolm. Unless there is nothing left to explain." Malcolm placed the glass back on the table with deliberate care. "Everyone deserves the chance to finish speaking," he replied calmly. Richard smiled again. "That almost sounds like surrender." Malcolm met his gaze without changing his expression. "It sounds like respect." The answer lingered over the polished table longer than anyone expected. For a brief moment, even those who had mocked him seemed uncertain why a man supposedly losing everything looked more composed than anyone else inside the room. Meanwhile, Emily quietly opened another confidential file hidden within the corporate archive. As she compared timestamps, author histories, and revision records, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Someone had not only edited the board presentation. Someone had carefully rewritten the story the board was about to vote on. She looked once more at the unopened folder resting in front of Malcolm, and for the first time that morning, she wondered if the only person who was not surprised by any of this was the man everyone believed had already lost. Richard Halston slowly closed the financial presentation and folded his hands with the confidence of a man who believed every outcome had already been arranged. "There is only one responsible path forward," he said, allowing his voice to travel to every corner of the boardroom. "The shareholders deserve leadership that inspires confidence, not uncertainty." Several directors nodded before he had even finished speaking. The agreement looked rehearsed, almost automatic, as though everyone had memorized their role long before the meeting officially began. Patricia Wells glanced toward Malcolm Brooks with an expression that disguised judgment beneath polished professionalism. "No one questions your work ethic," she said carefully. "But sometimes a company outgrows the person leading it." Another director added, "Markets react to perception. Right now perception is our biggest liability." Malcolm remained still. His eyes moved from one speaker to the next without the slightest trace of anger. The unopened folder remained exactly where it had rested since the meeting began, untouched beneath the bright lights reflecting from the polished table. Richard leaned forward. "I have to ask one final time. Are you planning to present anything in your defense?" Malcolm answered quietly. "When the appropriate time arrives." Richard sighed dramatically before looking around the room. "You see the problem. Every direct question receives another vague answer." Soft laughter spread once again. One director near the far end of the table whispered, "He was promoted too quickly." Another replied just loudly enough to be heard, "Some companies care more about appearances than qualifications these days." The words hung in the room with an uncomfortable weight. No one mentioned race directly. They did not need to. The implication was obvious enough that even the silence seemed embarrassed. Emily Carter stopped typing for a brief second. She looked toward the faces surrounding the table and realized she had heard similar comments before in smaller meetings, always dressed in polished corporate language, always careful enough to avoid crossing an obvious line while still leaving the same message behind. Malcolm had probably heard versions of those remarks for years. Yet he never reacted. That realization unsettled her more than the comments themselves. She quietly reopened the archived records on her laptop and compared another sequence of revisions. Additional discrepancies appeared. Entire paragraphs had been removed only hours before the meeting. Approval dates had been altered. Supporting exhibits had disappeared. Every change seemed designed to guide the board toward a single conclusion. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She glanced toward Malcolm again. He sat with the calm confidence of someone watching a clock count down toward an expected moment. Richard pressed another button, replacing the financial charts with a formal resolution displayed across the screen. The title read Proposed Vote of No Confidence in the Chief Executive Officer. Patricia looked directly at Malcolm. "We can avoid unnecessary embarrassment if you choose to resign before the vote." Malcolm offered a polite smile that revealed nothing. "Thank you for your concern." Richard shook his head. "Concern has limits." Malcolm answered with the same steady voice. "So does certainty." For the first time that morning, Richard's smile faded. It lasted only a second, but Emily noticed. She also noticed Malcolm gently resting one hand beside the unopened folder without lifting the cover. He was not protecting it. He was waiting. Whatever rested inside was clearly not intended to interrupt this meeting. It was meant to finish it. As the corporate secretary prepared the official ballots for distribution, the room grew quieter than it had been all morning. Every director believed the decisive moment had finally arrived. Only Malcolm appeared completely untouched by the pressure surrounding him, as though the real meeting had not actually begun yet. Emily Carter kept her expression perfectly neutral as she organized the printed ballots, but her attention was no longer on the board members. It was on the digital revision history quietly displayed across her laptop screen beneath the edge of the conference table. Every timestamp told the same story. The financial presentation had not evolved naturally through weeks of preparation. It had been altered repeatedly during the previous night, each revision removing information that favored Malcolm Brooks while emphasizing short-term fluctuations that supported Richard Halston's argument. The final edits had been approved using executive credentials that should never have been active outside normal governance procedures. Emily read the authorization log twice before she believed what she was seeing. Someone had deliberately rewritten the board's understanding of the company's performance only hours before the meeting began. She slowly looked around the room. Richard appeared completely at ease, casually chatting with another director while waiting for the vote. Patricia Wells reviewed her notes with quiet confidence. The remaining directors behaved like people expecting routine business instead of one of the most significant decisions in the company's history. Malcolm sat exactly as he had all morning. Calm. Patient. His unopened folder remained centered in front of him, untouched despite every invitation to reveal its contents. Emily could not understand it. If he already knew the presentation had been manipulated, why was he allowing the discussion to continue? She quietly opened another internal archive and searched the original board packet distributed 3 days earlier. The authentic version immediately appeared. Revenue growth projections were stronger. Acquisition performance exceeded expectations. Investor confidence surveys painted a completely different picture than the one currently displayed on the boardroom screen. Someone had not merely simplified the information. They had carefully reshaped the narrative. Emily's heartbeat became louder than the quiet hum of the room. She remembered arriving early that morning and finding Richard already inside the boardroom long before the support staff. At the time it had seemed harmless. Now that memory carried an entirely different weight. As she continued reviewing the records, another unexpected detail appeared. The altered files had bypassed the company's standard compliance review. That should have been impossible. Unless more than one person had participated. Emily slowly closed her laptop halfway and glanced toward Malcolm again. He caught her eyes for only a brief moment. He did not nod. He did not smile. He simply held her gaze with the quiet confidence of someone who already understood what she had discovered. For reasons she could not explain, that single look steadied her. Richard finally broke the silence. "Miss Carter, are the ballots ready?" Emily looked up immediately. "Yes, sir." "Excellent," Richard replied. "Once they are distributed, we will move directly to the vote. We have discussed this matter long enough." Emily stood and began placing a ballot before each director. When she reached Malcolm, she paused for less than a second. The black folder remained closed beneath the bright conference lights. She noticed that one corner of the cover carried a faint embossed company seal she had never seen before. Malcolm quietly thanked her as she placed the ballot on the table. His voice remained calm, almost reassuring. Emily returned to her seat, but instead of closing her laptop she opened one final audit report hidden deep within the corporate archive. A confidential notation appeared across the top of the screen. Governance review scheduled. Authorization locked until final vote. Emily stared at the words, then instinctively looked back toward the unopened folder. For the first time that morning, she realized Malcolm had never been waiting for the right argument. He had been waiting for the right moment, and whatever was about to happen had already been anticipated long before anyone entered the boardroom. The ballots rested untouched before each director, but no one reached for a pen. Richard Halston seemed to enjoy the silence, letting anticipation build as though the outcome itself had become another demonstration of his authority. He slowly stood and adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket before looking directly at Malcolm Brooks. "There is still time to spare yourself unnecessary humiliation," he said. "A voluntary resignation would preserve what remains of your reputation." Malcolm looked back without the slightest change in expression. "I appreciate the suggestion," he replied. "Please continue." The calm response irritated Richard far more than any heated argument could have. Patricia Wells leaned forward and folded her hands together. "Do you truly believe this company can move forward under your leadership after today?" Malcolm answered with the same measured tone. "I believe every organization eventually reveals whether it values truth or convenience." The room became noticeably quieter. One director shook his head with a faint smile. "That sounds inspiring," he said, "but investors do not buy inspiration. They buy confidence." Another director added, "Confidence has to be earned." A third quietly muttered, "Not handed out because it looks good in annual reports." The words carried the familiar edge that Malcolm had heard throughout his career. Nothing explicit. Nothing anyone would officially condemn. Just carefully polished remarks that questioned his legitimacy without ever speaking the real assumption aloud. For an instant, another boardroom from many years earlier crossed his mind. He had been 32 years old then, the youngest executive vice president in the company's history, sitting alone at the far end of another polished conference table. A visiting consultant had mistaken him for administrative support and asked if someone from management would be joining the meeting soon. When Malcolm introduced himself as the executive leading the acquisition, the room had fallen silent before someone laughed awkwardly and called it an honest mistake. It was not the last time someone underestimated him because of what they expected a chief executive to look like. He remembered another investor dinner where every question about strategy had been directed toward his white deputy until Malcolm quietly answered them himself with greater precision than anyone expected. Those moments had never pushed him to raise his voice. They had taught him something far more valuable. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they hold all the power. The memory faded as quickly as it had appeared. Malcolm returned his attention to the present without showing that anything had crossed his mind. Emily Carter watched him carefully. She had expected frustration, perhaps even disappointment. Instead, she saw remarkable composure, the kind that only came from someone who had already accepted every possible outcome. Her eyes drifted back to the confidential audit notice still displayed on her laptop. Governance review scheduled. Authorization locked until final vote. Those words echoed in her thoughts. Richard finally picked up his ballot. "Enough discussion," he announced. "We have responsibilities beyond endless debate." Several directors reached for their own ballots at the same moment. Malcolm did not. He simply rested one hand beside the unopened folder while the other remained calmly folded across the table. Emily noticed another detail she had overlooked before. The folder was not positioned toward Malcolm alone. It was centered so that every person around the table would eventually be able to see whatever rested inside. It had never been hidden. It had only been waiting. Richard uncapped his pen and smiled with complete confidence. After this vote, he said, this company begins a new chapter. Malcolm quietly replied, it certainly does. There was something unmistakable in the certainty of his voice. For the first time all morning, even those convinced they controlled the room felt an unexpected hesitation settle over the table, as though the moment they had been anticipating was not the one that truly mattered. Richard Halston gathered the completed ballots one by one with deliberate confidence, stacking them neatly in the center of the polished table as though each sheet of paper carried another piece of Malcolm Brooks's future. No one spoke while the final signatures were collected. The quiet inside the boardroom felt heavier than any argument that had filled the room earlier. Outside the glass walls, the city continued moving without interruption, but inside Ashcroft Capital headquarters every second seemed suspended between assumption and consequence. Richard looked around the table with unmistakable satisfaction. Before the ballots are counted, he announced, does anyone wish to make a final statement? Every face turned toward Malcolm. It was the opportunity they had expected him to seize all morning. The opportunity to defend himself, explain the numbers, challenge the accusations, or finally reveal whatever rested inside the unopened folder. Instead, Malcolm folded his hands calmly and answered with only 4 words. Please count the votes. Several directors exchanged puzzled looks. Patricia Wells frowned slightly. You are declining your final opportunity to address the board. Malcolm nodded once. I am. Richard almost smiled. Very well. Emily Carter watched the exchange with growing disbelief. The confidential audit notice remained open on her laptop exactly as before. Governance review scheduled. Authorization locked until final vote. The wording suddenly felt less like an administrative procedure and more like a countdown. Richard began reading each ballot aloud. Remove. Another ballot. Remove. The next. Remove. One after another the same word echoed across the room until it became almost rhythmic. Malcolm never reacted. He neither lowered his eyes nor shifted in his chair. He simply listened with the composure of someone hearing a sequence he had already memorized. Emily looked around the table instead of at the ballots. Something else had changed. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had become excitement. A few directors were already whispering about interim leadership, investor calls, and transition plans before the vote had even officially concluded. Richard reached the final ballot and placed it carefully on top of the stack. The board has spoken, he declared. The motion passes. Silence followed his announcement. It was not celebration. It was expectation. Every director looked toward Malcolm, waiting for disappointment, frustration, or perhaps a desperate attempt to reverse the outcome. Instead, Malcolm slowly placed both hands on the edge of the black leather folder for the first time since entering the room. He did not open it. Not yet. He simply rested his palms upon it and looked toward Emily. Their eyes met for only a moment. Emily understood immediately. Without saying a word, she reopened the confidential governance notice and noticed a new line had appeared automatically across the screen. Final vote confirmed. Governance authorization released. Her breathing caught. She quickly opened the linked archive. Dozens of restricted documents instantly became available, each carrying executive legal certifications that had been inaccessible only seconds earlier. Emily looked up at Malcolm again, then toward Richard, whose confidence remained completely untouched because he had not yet realized what had changed. Malcolm finally broke the silence. Mr. Halston, he said with the same calm voice that had carried him through every insult and accusation that morning, thank you for allowing the process to finish exactly as required. Richard leaned back comfortably. There is nothing left to discuss. Malcolm's expression never changed. "I believe," he replied quietly, his hand still resting on the closed folder, "there is finally something everyone in this room is authorized to see." For the first time that morning, Malcolm Brooks slowly lifted the cover of the black leather folder. No dramatic movement. No hurried gesture. Just a quiet motion that instantly pulled every pair of eyes toward the documents resting inside. The room that had echoed with confident voices only moments earlier became completely silent. Malcolm removed a single page and placed it carefully at the center of the polished table where Richard Halston could see the company seal embossed across the top. "Before anyone leaves," Malcolm said calmly, "this board is required to acknowledge the governance review that became active immediately after the final vote was recorded." Richard frowned as he reached for the document. "What governance review?" Malcolm answered without hesitation. "The independent review unanimously approved by the Governance and Ethics Committee 6 weeks ago." Richard's confident expression tightened. "That committee reports to the board." Malcolm gently shook his head. "Not after the amendments approved during last quarter's annual meeting." Emily Carter quickly opened the first document that had appeared in the newly unlocked archive. Her eyes widened. Malcolm was correct. The amendments had transferred investigative authority to an independent governance panel whenever executive leadership became the subject of an organized removal vote. Those records had remained sealed until the final ballot was officially certified. Malcolm placed a second document beside the first. Then a third. Each carried authenticated digital certifications, legal verification numbers, and executive signatures that no one in the room could dispute. Patricia Wells leaned forward, silently reading the heading across the first report. Independent Governance Investigation. Richard immediately reached for another page. His confidence faded further with every line he read. The investigation outlined unauthorized revisions to financial presentations, concealed performance reports, manipulated executive briefing materials, and repeated attempts to influence board voting through incomplete disclosures. Emily could hardly believe what she was seeing. Every discrepancy she had discovered throughout the morning appeared inside the investigation with precise timestamps, complete audit trails, and verified system logs. Nothing had been overlooked. Malcolm had never needed to defend himself because the evidence had already been collected by people entirely outside the boardroom. Richard finally looked up. "This is impossible." Malcolm remained composed. "No. It is documented." Patricia continued reading in complete silence before slowly lowering the report. "These revisions, or they were traced." Malcolm nodded. "Every edit. Every authorization. Every deleted exhibit. Every modified presentation." Emily quietly spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "The audit history matches exactly." Every head turned toward her. She swallowed carefully before continuing. "I verified the records myself during this meeting. The archived files and the investigation are identical." Richard immediately tried to recover control. "This proves nothing about intent." Malcolm calmly removed one final document from the folder and slid it across the table. It contained certified communication logs showing private coordination among several directors regarding presentation changes before the board meeting had officially convened. Richard stared at the page without speaking. Malcolm finally looked directly at him. His voice remained measured, almost gentle. "You spent the entire morning asking why I would not open this folder. Because evidence presented before the vote becomes an argument. Evidence presented after the vote becomes a record. You wanted this board to decide before seeing the truth. I wanted the truth to arrive after every decision had already been made." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken throughout the meeting. No one laughed. No one whispered. Even the city beyond the windows seemed impossibly distant. The unopened folder had never been Malcolm's defense. It had been the final witness, waiting until every assumption in the room had revealed itself beyond question. No one moved. The documents remained spread across the polished walnut table like mirrors reflecting every decision that had been made during the past hour. Richard Halston slowly lowered the final report, but the confidence that had defined him throughout the meeting was gone. His eyes searched the pages again as though reading them a second time might somehow produce a different outcome. It did not. Emily Carter quietly clicked another link inside the governance archive. A new notification immediately appeared across the large display at the front of the boardroom. Independent Governance Panel now in session. Executive Compliance Authorization active. Before anyone could respond, the conference room doors opened. 3 individuals entered with measured professionalism. The first was the company's general counsel, Daniel Foster. Beside him walked the chair of the Independent Governance Panel, Linda Marino. Behind them followed the Director of Corporate Compliance carrying a secured portfolio. None of them appeared surprised by what they found inside the room. Daniel Foster offered a respectful nod toward Malcolm before addressing the board. Good morning. The governance review has now been formally activated following certification of the final vote. We are here to execute the committee's findings. Richard immediately stood. This meeting is over. Daniel answered calmly. Respectfully, it is not. Under the amended governance charter approved by shareholder resolution, this review supersedes ordinary board procedure. Linda Marino opened the secured portfolio and distributed official notices one by one. Each document carried the corporate seal and independent certification. Patricia Wells accepted hers with visibly trembling hands. Richard stared at the notice placed before him without touching it. Daniel continued in the same measured tone. Effective immediately, the voting privileges of all directors identified within the investigation are temporarily suspended pending final ethics review. Access to confidential governance systems has also been restricted. Almost at once several electronic tablets resting around the table displayed the same notification. Access denied. Governance credentials suspended. Emily watched the room transform in complete silence. The authority that had seemed unquestionable only minutes earlier disappeared without raised voices, dramatic gestures, or public humiliation. It simply ceased to exist because the procedures everyone had agreed to months before were now operating exactly as designed. Patricia looked toward Malcolm with an expression that mixed disbelief and regret. You knew this would happen. Malcolm answered quietly. I knew the process would work if everyone was allowed to complete it. Richard finally spoke again. You planned this? Malcolm gently shook his head. No. I prepared for the possibility that integrity would be tested. Daniel Foster reviewed another document before continuing. The investigation also recommends immediate appointment of interim independent oversight until the review is concluded. Chief Executive Officer Brooks remains in full executive authority during that period because the vote conducted today has been declared procedurally compromised. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, remembering every dismissive comment, every subtle insult, every assumption that Malcolm had somehow arrived in the boardroom without earning his place. None of those voices remained confident now. Malcolm had never interrupted them because he had never needed to. They had revealed everything themselves. Richard slowly sat back in his chair, the realization finally settling across his face. The outcome he had celebrated only moments earlier no longer existed. It had dissolved under the weight of documented facts and lawful procedure. Malcolm quietly gathered the investigation reports into the black leather folder with the same calm precision he had shown since the beginning of the meeting. The room no longer felt like a battlefield between opposing sides. It felt like a place where truth had finally been given permission to speak, and once it had, no one possessed the authority to silence it again. The boardroom remained silent long after the official notices had been distributed. The skyline beyond the glass walls looked exactly as it had an hour earlier, yet everything inside the room had changed. Authority no longer belonged to the loudest voice or the most confident prediction. It belonged to the documented truth that now rested inside the black leather folder Malcolm Brooks calmly closed with both hands. The soft sound of the cover settling into place echoed across the polished table with surprising weight. No one interrupted him. No one challenged another page. No one laughed. Richard Halston sat motionless, staring at the empty space where certainty had once lived. Patricia Wells quietly removed her reading glasses and lowered her eyes. Around the table, directors who had entered believing they understood leadership now found themselves confronting something far more difficult than losing a vote. They were confronting the consequences of their own assumptions. Emily Carter slowly closed her laptop after confirming that every governance action had been completed. She looked toward Malcolm with a new understanding. Throughout the entire meeting he had never tried to defeat anyone with louder words. He had simply trusted that facts, patience, and process would eventually arrive at the same destination. Daniel Foster gathered the remaining legal documents while Linda Moreno thanked the board members for their cooperation before leaving the room with the compliance team. The doors closed quietly behind them. No celebration followed. Malcolm stood from his chair, straightened his jacket, and picked up the folder that had become the center of every conversation without needing to reveal its contents until the exact moment it mattered. He looked around the room one final time, making eye contact with every director before speaking. "Leadership is not measured by how quickly you answer an accusation," he said calmly. "It is measured by whether your character remains unchanged while others decide who they believe you are." The word settled over the room with a quiet force that no one attempted to answer. Malcolm continued. "Some of you believed silence meant weakness. Others believed confidence belonged only to the people speaking the most. But dignity does not rush to defend itself. It waits until truth can stand on its own." Emily felt those words stay with her more deeply than any presentation she had ever recorded. She realized that every subtle remark questioning Malcolm's qualifications, every polished comment suggesting he had not earned his place, had revealed far more about the people making those remarks than about the man receiving them. Malcolm placed the folder beneath his arm and walked toward the boardroom doors. Just before leaving, he paused without turning around. "Never mistake patience for surrender," he said. "And never confuse appearance with ability. The strongest foundation any company can build is not profit. It is integrity. Once that is compromised, every victory becomes temporary." With that, he stepped into the hallway. The doors closed gently behind him. Inside the boardroom, no one spoke for several long moments. The meeting that had begun with quiet ridicule ended with quiet reflection. Emily looked once more at the empty chair where Malcolm had been sitting and understood why he had never needed to raise his voice. Respect earned through integrity always lasts longer than power borrowed from prejudice. And on that morning, everyone in the room learned that the most powerful person is often the one who never feels the need to prove it before the truth is ready to speak for itself.